I came out of the anesthesia thinking about my garden. That sounds strange, I know. But when you're 64 years old and you've just spent 6 hours on an operating table, your mind goes to the most ordinary things. I remember thinking about the tomato plants I'd left on the back porch, whether the overnight frost had gotten to them. I remember the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a monitor beeping somewhere to my left. I remember a nurse saying my name, Raymond, Raymond, can you hear me? And I remember thinking, yes, I can hear you, but I need a minute, because I'm not quite ready to come back yet. Then I thought about my son, and I opened my eyes. My name is Raymond Garrett. I'm 64 years old. I taught high school history at Clarkfield High in eastern Tennessee for 31 years, and I coached the junior varsity baseball team for 22 of those years. I am not a complicated man. I never wanted much. A decent house, a garden that kept me busy on weekends, and a son I was proud of. For most of my life, I thought I had all three. My son's name is Derek. He's 39 years old and looks more like his mother than he does like me, tall, with dark eyes and a smile that could light up a room when he wanted it to. When he was 7, he used to sit on the kitchen counter and watch me cook dinner, asking me questions about everything. Why does water boil? Why does the sky change color at sunset? I loved those evenings. I used to think, this is what it's all for, this right here. His mother, my wife Linda, passed when Derek was 22. Pancreatic cancer, very fast, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't talk too much about that because even now, 12 years later, it's not something I can discuss without my voice going somewhere I don't want it to go. What I'll say is that after Linda died, Derek and I held on to each other the way two people do when they've both lost the same person. We talked every Sunday. He came home for Thanksgiving. I drove down to Atlanta twice a year to see him and his wife, Melissa, and later their daughter, Sophie. That was the life. That was the arrangement. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Then, 2 years ago, Derek got sick. He called me on a Tuesday evening in October. I remember I was grading papers. I do some part-time tutoring now. Nothing formal, just helping kids from the county who need it, and I almost let the call go to voicemail because I was in the middle of a thought. I'm glad I picked up. He didn't say hello. He just said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." And the way he said it, I put my pen down immediately. His liver had been failing for almost 2 years before he told me. He'd been keeping it from me, he said, because he didn't want me to worry. A condition called primary sclerosing cholangitis, a word I had to write down on a notepad just to remember it was attacking the bile ducts in his liver, and the doctors at Emory had been managing it with medication. But now the medication wasn't enough. He needed a transplant. He was already on the waiting list, but they didn't know how long it would take. And the doctors had mentioned that a living donor was an option if a match could be found. I said, "Derek, have you been tested against me?" He said, "Dad, no, I don't want you to." I said, "Have you been tested against me?" A long pause. Then, "No." I said, "Then call your doctor tomorrow and have them send me whatever I need to do." Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this to make myself sound noble. I am telling you this because it is what happened, and because the kind of man I am, the kind of man I was raised to be by my father and my grandfather before him, does not sit in a comfortable house in Tennessee while his only son is dying in Atlanta. You do not calculate the cost of saving your child. You simply do not. The testing took 6 weeks. There were blood draws and imaging scans and consultations with 3 different specialists, and every single time a result came back, I told myself, let it be a match, let it be a match. And on a Thursday afternoon in late November, a coordinator named Dr. Paulson called me and told me that I was, in fact, a compatible donor for a partial liver transplant. I was healthy enough. The surgery was possible. I cried in my truck for about 10 minutes. Not from fear, from relief. I flew to Atlanta in January. The surgery was scheduled for a Wednesday. Derek and Melissa picked me up from the airport on the Monday before, and they took me to dinner at a restaurant downtown. And Derek kept saying, "Dad, you don't have to do this." And I kept saying, "I know." And he kept saying it anyway. And I kept saying the same thing back, because we both understood that the conversation was more ritual than substance at that point. The decision had been made months ago. The night before the surgery, Derek came to my hotel room alone. Melissa had stayed home with Sophie. He sat on the edge of the bed and we watched the end of a basketball game neither of us cared about. And at some point he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I don't know how to thank you for this, Dad. I really don't," I said. "You don't have to thank me. Just get better. That's all I want." He nodded. He looked at the television. Then he said there was some paperwork the hospital needed me to sign before the procedure in the morning, something about his medical decision-making in case of complications on his end, giving him the ability to authorize changes to the surgical plan if I was under anesthesia and something unexpected came up. He said the hospital's patient advocate had mentioned it was standard for living donor cases. He handed me a folder. I should have read every word. I know that now. But it was 10:30 at night, and I was 64 years old, and I was having surgery in 11 hours, and my son was sitting right there next to me telling me it was standard hospital paperwork. So I signed where he pointed. 3 pages, 4 signatures, 1 set of initials. I handed him the folder. He put it in his bag. He hugged me for a long time before he left. The surgery went well, from what the doctors told me afterward. The partial resection was clean. My recovery, they said, would take 4 to 6 weeks normal for a living liver donor. I'd be in the hospital for at least 2 weeks, then need a caregiver or a rehabilitation facility for the rest of the recovery period. On the 3rd day after surgery, Derek came to my room. I want to describe how he looked because I've thought about it many times since then. He was dressed well, a button-down shirt, good shoes, and he looked healthy, better than he had in years, actually. His color was back. He was standing up straight. He looked like a man who had gotten exactly what he needed. He sat down in the chair beside my bed and he asked how I was feeling, and I told him I was sore but okay. And we talked for a few minutes about Sophie and about a home improvement project he was thinking about, and then he reached into the bag he'd brought with him and set a folder on the tray table in front of me. He said, "Dad, I need you to sign a few more things." I looked at the folder. I said, "What is this?" He said it was related to the paperwork from the night before the surgery. He said the hospital needed clarification on a few financial disclosures, something about insurance coordination between his plan and mine, since I'd used my insurance for the donor surgery. He said it was just a formality and that his lawyer had reviewed everything. I should have said, "Let me have my own lawyer look at it first." I know that now too. But I was 3 days out of major surgery. I was on pain medication. My son was sitting beside me, looking healthy and alive, and I had just given him a piece of my body, and I trusted him with an openness I cannot fully explain to anyone who has not raised a child and spent 40 years loving them. I signed. He took the folder. He squeezed my hand. He said he'd be back on the weekend. He wasn't. I called him on Saturday afternoon. Voicemail. I called Melissa. Voicemail. I texted both of them. Nothing. I told myself they were busy, that having a post-transplant patient at home was exhausting, that I was being impatient. On Sunday, I called again. Nothing. On Monday, a nurse named Carol, a quiet woman with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, came in and asked if I'd been in contact with my family about my discharge plan. I said I was working on it. She looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand at the time. On Tuesday, my discharge coordinator told me that my son had been in contact with the hospital's financial office. He had, she said carefully, made arrangements for my post-discharge care at a facility called Meadowbrook Recovery Center, about 40 minutes outside Atlanta. She said a private room had been prepaid for 30 days. I said, "Derek arranged that?" She said yes. I said, "Without talking to me first?" She said yes, and there was something in her voice that was very gentle, very controlled, the way a person sounds when they are trying to say something difficult without saying it. I called Derek from the hospital room right there. He answered this time. I said, "Derek, what is going on? Why didn't you talk to me about Meadowbrook?" He said, "Dad, it's a good facility. You'll be comfortable there. You need proper care." I said, "I would rather come home with you for a couple of weeks, or go back to Tennessee when I'm cleared to travel." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Actually, Dad, about Tennessee, there are some things we need to talk about." I felt something shift in my chest, not pain from the surgery, something else. He said, "Remember the paperwork you signed before the surgery and then in the hospital?" He said one of those documents had been a temporary power of attorney, giving him authority over my financial accounts during my incapacitation. He said the other documents, the ones in the hospital, had been related to my property in Tennessee. I said, Derek. What did you do? He said he had transferred my savings account into a joint account in his name. He said the house, my house, the house I had lived in for 27 years, the house where he grew up, the house his mother and I had painted together one summer and argued about the color for 3 weeks. He said the house had been listed with a real estate agent. I couldn't speak for a moment. I actually could not form words. He said, Dad, the medical costs have been significant, and Melissa and I have been carrying a lot of the financial burden, and we thought it made more sense to consolidate things so everything was in one place while you recovered. I said, Derek, that is my house. That is my money. That is everything I have. He said, I know, and I know this is hard to hear, and I'm sorry, but this is the situation we're in. Then he said he had to go, and he hung up. I sat in that hospital bed for a long time. The monitor beeped. Someone in the hallway was laughing at something. The afternoon light came through the window blinds in thin yellow lines across the floor. I am not a man who cries easily. I have buried my parents. I have buried my wife. But I sat there and I cried, because I had given my son a part of my body, and he had used my unconscious hands to take everything else I had. Carol, the nurse, found me like that when she came in for the evening vitals check. She sat down without being asked. She handed me a tissue and waited. When I could talk, I told her what had happened. Not all of it. Enough. She said, Raymond, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did you read those documents before you signed them? I said no. I said my son told me they were hospital paperwork. She wrote something on a notepad. Then she said there was a hospital social worker named Mr. Delaney who worked with patients in difficult situations, and she'd like to bring him by in the morning if that was all right with me. She also said, very quietly, that I shouldn't sign anything else without having someone read it to me first. I said, Carol, do you know something I don't? She looked at me. She said, I know that you're a good man and that you deserve to be treated like one. That was all she said. But it was enough. Mr. Delaney came the next morning and he sat with me for 2 hours. He had a calm, unhurried way about him, the kind of man who had clearly heard very difficult things many times and had learned not to show it in his face. He listened to everything. Then he made 3 phone calls while I was right there in the room. The first was to the hospital's legal compliance office. The second was to an attorney whose name I won't mention here, but who he clearly knew well. The third was to my county's Adult Protective Services office in Tennessee. He said, Raymond, what was done to you has a name. It's called financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The documents signed while you were on pre-surgical medication and post-surgical pain management may not be legally enforceable. He said, we are going to need to move carefully, but we are going to move. I asked about the house. He said the real estate listing could potentially be challenged if we acted quickly enough before a sale was completed. I asked about the savings. He said the transfer to the joint account was a more complicated question, but not an impossible one. I asked why my son had done this. He looked at me for a moment and then said, I don't know the answer to that, Raymond. I don't think the answer would help you heal anyway. He was right about that. The attorney, a woman named Diane Walsh, came to see me 2 days later. She was no nonsense, mid-50s, with a yellow legal pad and a directness I immediately appreciated. She reviewed photographs of the documents I had signed. Carol had helped me request copies from the records office. She went through each one with me, explaining what I had actually signed. The power of attorney had been drafted not as a temporary medical document, as Derek had described it, but as a durable financial power of attorney with no expiration date. The hospital documents, the ones I had signed from my bed 3 days post-surgery, while on scheduled pain medication, included a quitclaim deed for my Tennessee property and a signature card adding Derek as sole owner of my savings account. Diane said, Raymond, I want to be straightforward with you. These documents were obtained under fraudulent pretenses. You were described as having given informed consent, but the description of what you were signing was deliberately inaccurate, and you were in a demonstrably compromised state when you signed the latter set. This is not a gray area. This is fraud. I asked her, honestly, how far she thought we could get. She said, the house is still listed, not sold. We can file an emergency injunction to halt the sale today. As for the savings, Derek has had access for about 3 weeks. We need to find out how much is left and trace where it went. I felt sick. Not from the surgery, from the thought of what I might find. What we found, over the following 2 weeks while I was still at Meadowbrook Recovery Center, which turned out to be a perfectly decent facility. Whatever Derek's reasons for putting me there was this. Approximately $41,000 had been moved out of my savings account in the 3 weeks since Derek had gained access. Airline tickets to Mexico, a hotel stay, a watch I later found out cost more than my first car. The rest had gone to a credit card account in Derek and Melissa's name. My house had received 2 showings but no offers. The injunction Diane filed stopped the listing cold. And through the hospital's compliance office, a record was surfaced that I had not known about. The surgical consent documents I had signed before the operation had included a witness attestation from a hospital staff member, a patient services coordinator, stating that I had been clearly informed of the contents of each. Tenshing. Diane got that coordinator on the phone within 48 hours. The coordinator said she had been told by the person bringing the documents that they were standard living donor consent forms. She had not read them carefully. She had initialed the witness line as a formality. That coordinator, to her enormous credit, agreed to provide a sworn statement. The case went to Fulton County District Court 7 weeks later. I was out of Meadowbrook by then and staying in a spare room at the home of a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who had been a colleague of mine at Clarkfield High for 15 years before she retired to the Atlanta suburbs to be near her grandchildren. She had driven to Meadowbrook the week after Carol called her. Carol had found her number in my phone's recent calls, and she had sat in my room and taken my hand and said, "Raymond Garrett, you are not spending another night in this place without a plan." I don't know that I would have gotten through those weeks without Evelyn. She cooked dinner every night. She drove me to the attorney's office. She sat in the waiting room during every court filing. She didn't ask me how I felt about Derek, and I appreciated that more than I can say, because I did not know how I felt about Derek, and I did not want to find out in someone's kitchen over a plate of food. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in March. Diane had filed for both the invalidation of the fraudulent documents and a civil claim for the recovery of the transferred funds. Derek hired an attorney, a man who spoke very quickly and used a great many words to say very little. He argued that the documents had been signed voluntarily and that I had been of sound enough mind to understand them. Diane introduced 3 things into evidence. First, my medical records from the night before surgery, which showed the sedative medication I had been given as part of pre-surgical preparation. Second, the pain medication administration log from my post-surgical hospital stay, documenting the drugs I had been given in the hours before the second set of signings. Third, the sworn statement from the patient services coordinator, explaining that she had been misled about the nature of the documents she witnessed. Diane also called Dr. Paulson, my surgical coordinator, who testified that living liver donors are typically in a significantly impaired cognitive state for the first 5 to 7 days post-operation due to both the procedure itself and the pain management protocols, and that obtaining any document of legal significance from a patient during that window would be, in his clinical opinion, ethically and procedurally improper. Derek's attorney tried to argue that I was an educated man, a former teacher, and should have known what I was signing. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Wren, looked at him for a moment without expression and then said, "Are you suggesting that a 64-year-old man recovering from major organ donation surgery should be held to a higher standard of legal scrutiny than his own son held himself to when presenting those documents?" The attorney did not have a good answer for that. Judge Wren ruled that the durable power of attorney was invalid due to fraudulent misrepresentation, that the quitclaim deed was void for the same reason, and that the $41,000 removed from my account constituted converted funds subject to full recovery, with interest. Derek was referred to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges. I won't tell you how I felt watching him walk out of that courtroom, because I'm not sure there's a word for the combination of grief and relief and exhaustion that goes through a father at a moment like that. I will tell you that I did not look at him, and that he did not look at me, and that somewhere in the hallway I could hear Sophie, my granddaughter, 6 years old, who had been sitting with Melissa in the back of the room asking her mother why Grandpa Raymond looked so sad. That was the hardest part. The house in Tennessee was taken off the market within the week. My savings account was partially restored through the civil judgment. I recovered $37 of the $41,000, which is not everything, but is more than I expected. I drove back to Clarkfield in April, 6 weeks after the hearing, and I sat on my back porch and looked at the tomato plants I had been worrying about on the operating table, and I thought about how strange it is that we spend our lives protecting the things and people we love, and we never once think about protecting ourselves from them. A few months after I came home, I got a letter. Not from Derek. From a man named Gerald Hutchins, who lived in Marietta, Georgia. Gerald had received a partial liver from a donor 3 years ago, not from me, from someone else, and had gone on to found a small non-profit that connected organ donors with support, resources, and advocacy. He had somehow heard about my situation through the hospital network. I don't know exactly how, and he wrote me a 3-page letter that I have read probably 20 times since. He said he had heard that a man had given a piece of himself to save his son and had been left with nothing for it. He said he hoped I would allow him to reach out, and that he hoped I hadn't given up on the idea that a sacrifice like mine meant something. He said that in his experience, the people who give the most are often the ones who have the hardest time believing they deserve anything in return. I called him. We talked for 2 hours. He invited me to speak at one of his nonprofits events in the fall, not about what Derek had done, but about what the decision to donate had meant to me, before everything that came after. I said yes, and I meant it. And when I stood up in front of 60 people at a community center in Marietta in November and talked about sitting on the kitchen counter at age 7 asking my father about the color of the sky, and about the phone call on a Tuesday evening in October when my son told me he was sick, and about the morning before the surgery when I thought, let it be a match, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including mine. Gerald shook my hand afterward. He said, Raymond, you still have a lot to give. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as a reminder. I am 64 years old. I have 1 kidney's worth of liver left inside me. I have a house in Tennessee with a back porch and tomato plants and $37,000 in a savings account that belonged to no one but me. I have an old colleague named Evelyn who calls me every Sunday, and a social worker named Mr. Delaney who sent me a Christmas card, and a nurse named Carol who I will think about with gratitude for the rest of my life. I do not know what will happen with Derek. The district attorney's review is ongoing. I have not spoken to him since the courthouse hallway. I think about Sophie sometimes more than sometimes, and I hope she grows up knowing that love is not a transaction, that you do not calculate what a person owes you for the things you do in their name. I see the signs now that I couldn't see then. The way Derek never asked about the details of my recovery. The way he changed the subject when I mentioned the surgery to other people. The way Melissa always left the room when Derek and I talked on the phone. I see all of it now, clearly. The way you can only see a thing clearly once you're standing far enough away from it. But I also see this. I made the right decision. Not about the paperwork, God knows I would change that. But about the surgery. About getting on that plane in January. About saying, yes, test me. I want to know if I'm a match. I would do it again. Not for the son who sat in that hospital room with a folder on his lap, but for the 7-year-old boy on the kitchen counter asking me why the sky changes color. For that boy, I would do it 100 times. And maybe that's the thing I needed to understand. That love, real love, the kind that holds up after everything. It doesn't ask for anything back, but it also doesn't give away what it can't afford to lose. And you have to know the difference before someone else decides it for you. I'm still learning that. At 64, I'm still learning. But I'm learning it in my own house, on my own back porch, with tomato plants that somehow made it through the frost. And that, for now, is more than enough.